Hello, friends. So, y'all know I do not typically discuss like pop culture news and stuff like that as of yet because I'm just not there yet. So, I don't really touch on the whole Nene of it all and the discourse that we have week by week about her not being on Atlanta. Because I've said before, I just feel like there's so much negativity and forced negativity about the show because people don't have their faves on there, and I just don't agree with those types of critiques. And I've also had my own opinions. I have my own opinions about Nene and like the way she speaks about the show and like her critiques of it as well. And so I just don't typically say anything about it. Not on here. I have my tweets for sure, but I don't usually say anything about it. But she's now done this interview with Carlos King. Y'all know I watch Carlos King's interviews and his reviews. And I wanted to do a review because I actually thought that it was a very good interview. And it's a two-part. So I wanted to do it in two parts just to make sure everything got the attention that it's supposed to get. I want to start out by basically there was a lot of talk between Carlos and Nene, basically giving context and saying, Carlos had previously asked Nene to do the interview, and she let him know, previously, well, I'm not ready. And now at this point, she let him know, okay, I'm ready. Let's do the interview. And I like that because I do genuinely feel like, obviously, we know a lot has gone on in Nene's life with Greg passing and what happened with Brent when he had his accident. He was in the hospital. And now what's happened with, dang, I'm forgetting her other son's name. Like with his arrest. So she's had a lot going on, right? And so, I can see her not I don't know when that was when she told him that she wasn't ready, but I can see that being hard for her. So I'm happy that now it seems like she came back and, Carlos's first question to her was like, "How are you?" which I thought was great. And she's like, "I'm good." She seemed like she was good. Like I made a critique before, like when she most recently did she like talked to TMZ and she gave some critiques of the show as she typically does. It just came off as very bitter to me and I didn't like that. Like I hate to see that side of Nene because I that's honestly one of my biggest critiques about her, but we'll get into it. But she can sometimes come off bitter, I feel like. Even when she was like in her last moments on Atlanta, her last seasons or whatever, she just came off as bitter to me sometimes and I hated that. Somebody that's watched Nene from the beginning in real time, like I'm not somebody that went back and binge watched Atlanta. I was watching Atlanta when it came on day one. So I've been watching her on the show and I've seen the changes, but we're gonna talk about it. But yeah, I just feel like it just felt like her energy was really in a good place and she was expressing herself well and she felt present and she felt like she was good and she just felt like she was being Nene. There were some things that I disagreed with, but there were a ton of things that I understood that she was saying, and I thought that they were good points. So let me just get into it because I just keep talking around it. First of all, I think she looked amazing. I mean, I know she's had her work done and all that good stuff, and she wasn't being shy about that. She even kikied about it a little bit, but I thought she looked fantastic. So I'm gonna say that first. The first thing that I picked up on was her talking about Sheree. And basically, they first kind of kiki about how Sheree left her off of the list. That season one party that Sheree had where Nene couldn't get into the function, Kim's like, my name's on the list, Nene's isn't, so that whole thing, and how Sheree has finally, acknowledged that she did it on purpose because she wasn't really getting along with Nene. So Carlos is just asking her, like, what is your relationship with Sheree? And she's like, we just never really saw eye to eye, and she talks about how, Sheree can be cool and she can be, fun when she wants to be, but like, also there's not really anything that interesting about her. And she talks about the fact that she feels like, she and Kim were really the ones that were valued by the network, I guess I would say, as it pertains to the show. And Sheree was, she was fine for the show and she played her role and she did what she had to do, but like, she's not really like, that valued, I guess. Like the show didn't really need her, is kind of what she was saying. And I don't feel like she was saying that in a nasty, rude, or like bitter way. I feel like she was just expressing her opinion. So I didn't mind her saying that. it's and I also kind of can see it because it is kind of like, she says she's like, Sheree's not really the most interesting, and that's true. She's not the most interesting, but Sheree has this thing about her, and I've said that even before. She just recently came back to Housewife, and I started disagreeing with her so much. But I was recently one of the people that was like, bring Sheree back, because there really is just something about Sheree that's fun to watch. It's just something about her personality that can be fun to watch. But otherwise, I'd have to agree. I mean, she's not the most interesting, and that's not a read, but it's just like, it is what it is. Carlos then asked her a really good question about, for me, it felt like the whole interview, I'll say, it felt like Nene, like an interview should be, it felt like Nene had her perspective and she had her feelings on things. But Carlos also had his perspective and his view on things, and they were both able to kind of volley those things back and forth, and they had different views on things, and they would sometimes be clear about that and say, well, I didn't see it that way, or like, oh, well, I kind of saw it like this, and it was done respectfully and tastefully, and it wasn't catty, and it wasn't any weird energy like you may expect from an interview combination of Nene and Carlos. It felt like a very serious interview, actually, which I almost was afraid that it wouldn't be, but it was. And so I say that to say, so Carlos asked her a really good question about, do you feel like you developed an ego after season one? What I liked about that question is the fact that A, it is something that a lot of people say. B, it's not a comfortable question to be asked, right? So it's not like Carlos brought her on for this interview for her to just talk mess about the other ladies and talk mess about the show, and he could just kind of key and set up a platform for it. No, it wasn't that. He's asking a question that other people won't want to know. And then C, I thought it was good because something I've always been vocal about is I think that, quote unquote, the downfall of Nene and the aspect of Housewives was her ego. And I think that what happened with Nene on the show is, do I want to get into this now? I guess I'll say generally, I think what happened with Nene on the show, but she gave some context to this, so I'll get into that as well. I'm not saying this as a read. I think what happened to Nene on the show is that she realized that she was a star of Atlanta. Like, she's an enormous part of the Real Housewives of Atlanta. You cannot think about the Real Housewives of Atlanta and not think about Nene. Her memes are everywhere. I use her memes. I use her sayings everywhere. However, that doesn't mean that you're untouchable. And I think that one of Nene's faults, one of her biggest faults, was that she lacked the self-awareness to realize, like, yeah, you are the star of this show and you're a very important part of this. But I think that Nene got to a point where she almost felt like she was untouchable. Like, they're all like, nobody could really say anything to her almost. And I think that she almost, I say a lack of self-awareness, but I'm gonna get into that more. But yeah, I think that ego really did get to Nene. In a bigger way, what I want to say, a big part that I've always talked about is there was a season, I'm not good with season numbers, y'all know that. But there's a season where she had really blown up, and she did Chicago, and she did the new normal, and she had started going back and forth to LA. Like, that was her storyline one season. Like, she was traveling back and forth to LA and doing her thing. And at that reunion, if I'm not mistaken, one of her biggest gripes with the ladies, this is when she kind of started getting into her dynamic where she's like, well, these ladies are not my friends, they're my coworkers, and they don't support me. I always felt like Nene was saying, this is my opinion, I always felt like that was Nene's ego speaking, and Nene saying, like, what, they don't treat me like I'm the queen of housewives. Like, they don't bow down to me, and they don't give me the respect that I feel like I deserve. Like, I'm Nene, I'm doing all of this, I'm on Broadway and all that stuff. And all of that is true. Like, remember, I don't know if y'all remember, she had that back and forth with Candy at one of the reunions, and Candy was basically saying the same thing. Like, all of that is true. Like, you're doing amazing things, but at the same time, it doesn't mean, and I hope I articulate this well, because again, none of this is a read. That doesn't mean that people are gonna kiss your. And it kind of almost felt like it. At times, it would feel like Nene wanted people to kiss her. She didn't want people to hold her accountable, and it didn't feel like you could say anything to Nene and you could touch Nene. Like Nene just couldn't be wrong. Like we just had to praise her, and it's almost the same thing with Marlo that we see on this season of Housewives. Like you want grace, right? Like you want people to give you grace and you want people to praise you and give you compliments and stuff, but you can't want that stuff while you're mistreating people. And I don't feel like Nene was always the nicest to the ladies, and she had her reasons. I think she gave good context in this interview, but still, it's two sides to every story. I don't think Nene was always the friendliest with the ladies, and I don't think that they always had great relationships. Even if she wasn't being unfriendly to them, maybe they didn't have great relationships. So it's not anybody's obligation or duty to be like, "Yay, good job, Nene," even though that's what she wants, and I can understand her wanting that because that's a natural human thing. Like you want that type of acknowledgement, but nobody owed her that. And so that's what I mean when I feel like she had built up this ego, like, and almost felt like she felt like she was owed that type of respect. Like just give me positive. Don't give me anything negative. You can't say nothing negative to me. Just give me positive. But it was just like nobody owes you that. And since she wasn't getting it, she always felt like the girls were against her, and it just created this thing. So I think that that was a big issue with ego. That being said, I just went really around. But that being said, Carlos had asked that question. That's why I thought it was a good question. But unfortunately, and again, not a read, but Nene said, she didn't feel like she had an ego, and that's fine for her to feel, But I think that when she was talking about it, she basically was saying, and she did make a point, but I don't think that the two were connected. She basically was saying, people will tear you apart on these TV shows and they'll talk about your looks and, all these things. And she's like, well, people have torn me apart and they talk about my nose and talked about my body and talked about my hair and my makeup. So I go get all of these things fixed and now they're talking about me again. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, she's like, you've torn me apart and I went to go get these things fixed and now you're saying that I've changed. And she's like, it's inevitable that I'm going to change because y'all tore me apart. That's true, right? And I think it does lend itself to the argument where it's like, oh, Nene has an ego and that caused her to change on the show. That's also true, but we're talking about two different types of changes, right? Like, we're more so talking about like personality change and ego change and feeling bigger than yourself and bigger than the show and acting that way. And she's talking more about like physical appearance change. Those things can sometimes combine, but I don't think that that's what the question was meant for. And I'm not saying that to say that she talked around it, but I just think she kind of missed that point almost maybe. But I wish that she had some type of level of self-awareness, which I'm probably going to say 1,300 more times, to be able to say like, yeah, maybe I did develop some type of ego, because I think that that's a big piece that Nene is missing. And I think, I'm fast forwarding, but I'll circle back around to it towards the end. But I think if and when she ever gets to the point to say, maybe, not even to say affirmatively, right? Because she may not feel that way. But if she's able to say, like, it's a possibility that my ego got in the way of me having a better connection and relationship with the cast, I think that that would take her so much further, just to be able to have that type of perspective. So that was a big part for me. She then goes on to do, I think she did really, 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 really well. I think they both did, but it's her interview. But so what I'm saying, she goes on to talk about how Kenya coming on the show kind of changed the way that Housewives was done. And I'm seeing something that was really frustrating me. I'm seeing a lot of mischaracterization of her saying that on the internet, and people are saying, oh my gosh, she's saying Kenya came on the show and she changed everything with fake storylines, and that's not what she said. And I think she did a really good job at saying, she said it. If you watch it, she's like, I think around that time is when things changed. And I'm not saying, she said this, she said, I'm not saying Kenya did it, but I'm saying I think around that time is when things changed. And then Carlos did come in. I'm going to give everybody their credit. Carlos did come in and ask, again, I don't think he's being messy. He was just clarifying. He said, so you're saying that when Kenya came in, that changed things? Or he asked something to that effect. And she's just like, again, she was clearing it up. She's like, I'm just saying around that time is when things changed. So I think that it was good that what I'm getting to is, I think it's good that she wasn't putting blame on Kenya, because that's not a Kenya thing. Like, I think that Kenya has caught a lot of flack since she came on the show, because a lot of the girls, there was always this thing where it's like, oh, Kenya has fake boyfriends and Kenya has fake storylines. Like, that's what we always just talk about, reunion after reunion. And at some point, and I think what we're realizing now, because we have conversations about Atlanta all the time, I think what we're realizing now is that production plays a large part in what's going on this show at the end of the day. And from what I gathered from what Nene was saying, she was speaking more to the point where she was saying, she even said this out her mouth, like, she feels like when Kenya came, at that point, it had become a thing where it was like, well, fake storylines were coming up, and it became more of a thing of trying to please production. And that's just not necessarily what Nene herself was trying to do, because they hadn't been used to doing that. And she said this happened around season 4, season 5, whenever Kenya came on. I don't know myself. And she couldn't recall if it was season 4, season 5. I think Carla said it was season 5. But she's saying, yeah, like before that point, like, they didn't have anybody that had to do that. Like, she spoke very clearly, mostly about herself, Kim, and Sheree, and even Deshawn for that one season. We kind of lost Lisa a little bit. She didn't talk that much about Lisa and Deshawn, but you know what I'm saying. But mostly, like, her, Kim, and Sheree, like, everything that they were doing was real and it was natural. Like, they weren't used to putting on for the camera. And then around the time where Kenya came on, it just felt like production was looking for more. And I feel like we can draw back to that and draw reference from that and say, that makes sense because we're watching this season now in real time and we're even realizing as viewers issues with production. And then we watch shows like Speak on It and we see live tweets from cast members talking about, production pushing this kind of silliness. So it's all kind of coming together and I'm happy that she spoke on that. And she even went back past Kenya, or well, before Kenya, I should say. And she's like, it kind of started a little bit with Phaedra, because she's like, Phaedra came on the show the season before, or whatever, one of those, or whatever, before Kenya, shortly before Kenya. And even she had got to a weird point where, she wasn't wanting to share as much about her pregnancy, like she wasn't being as forthcoming. So she even said, like, everybody just wasn't being as authentic anymore as she had been used to. And I thought that that was fair to say. I think we all know that. And I think it was nice that she was able to, again, not make it as like just a blame. I think it takes two to tango, right? So it's not just a blame on the cast member, but it's also a blame on production, right? And I don't think that Phaedra single-handedly came on the show and kind of messed up the flow and brought in the fakeness of the storylines. I don't think Kenya single-handedly came on the show and brought in the fakeness of the storylines. What I'm picking up is, and I feel like Nene shed good light on it, you have to think. When we started this show, let's just stick to those three. We had Nene, Kim, and Sheree. We didn't know those women before this show started. They were legit housewives. There was nothing, Sheree had like a boutique or whatever, and they were kind of like known around Atlanta, I guess. You have to be put on the show. But it's like around the world, we didn't know who they were. They weren't like household names. And they even started talking about how at a certain point, like Atlanta was everywhere. It was been talked about everywhere. Like on SNL, Oprah was talking about it. Like it was getting 500 million viewers, or they said something like that. Like it was a big show. So when they were bringing people on the show, we also have to realize, I don't think people sit back and think, one of the issues that we've most recently picked up on, because it's taken some time for us to understand the production aspect, right? One of the most recent issues we picked up on is casting. You know how we always talk about how weird casting is? It's always been like that, though. Since the beginning of time, since they started adding women to that cast from the very jump, it's always been these women with names, right? So, like, they added Candy Burris. So it's like, hello from Escape. Like, we know Candy. And when she was brought on, like I said, I watched Atlanta in real time. So I remember them bringing Candy on. And it was a big deal that they were bringing Candy on because she was Candy from Escape. You get what I'm saying? So from the jump, when they were bringing women onto Atlanta, I think from a production standpoint and from a network standpoint, it was because the show was so big and it has this black audience and it's in Atlanta, which is like the black Hollywood, the black Mecca. It's like, oh, we need name brand. You know what I'm saying? We can't just keep bringing on regular women. We need more. We need something to make it more spicy, more notoriety. So this started from the jump. Candy came on the show, what, season 2, season 3? This been started, you know what I'm saying? And then, yeah, Candy came season 2. Then season 3, it was Phaedra and Cynthia. Name, brand. Phaedra was already known for being a famous attorney. When she came on the show, it was a big deal because she was a noted attorney. Like we knew who that was. People knew who that was. Maybe not everybody, but people knew who Phaedra Parks was. She had a name, Cynthia Bailey. Everybody may not have known who she was, but the network knew who she was. It was important because she was Cynthia Bailey. She was a supermodel. You get where I'm going? So it's not like they were just bringing on random people. Then we finally get to Portia and Kenya. Same thing. Kenya Moore, Black Miss USA. It was a big deal because she was Kenya Moore. Portia was a big deal because of her grandfather, Jose Sanchez, in Atlanta. So that's what 5 housewives that I named right there. The first 5 additions to that show, they were all brought on because of who they were in the streets, because of their name. So this has been a thing in Atlanta. So I don't think that it's like basically Nene was saying, like at that point, season 4, season 5, they had just started pushing storylines. Like they were putting on from a production standpoint, right? They were bringing on people to amp things up. And I think it started mostly with Kenya because Kenya was the only one that was like an actress. You know what I'm saying? Like everybody else they brought on, like they had names, but it was just like Kenya was the actress and they knew that she was going to put on. So of course they had to make her make sense. You know what I'm saying? When Kenya even moved to Atlanta and started the show, she was living out of that hotel with the white refrigerator. That lady didn't live in Atlanta. She didn't have a life in Atlanta. She didn't have anything going on in Atlanta. She was hired as an actress to do a job on that show. That's not her fault. That is production. So at the end of the day, it makes total and complete sense that the dynamic of that show and where we are now started at the point that they were doing casting like that. It makes sense. And it's been a persistent issue, but it started so early on. I mean, what can you do now, right? So I like that Nene had that conversation. I wish that it wasn't being mischaracterized so much on the internet, but I'm hoping that when the ladies listen to it, especially Kenya, I hope that they actually listen to it in context and hear the whole thing instead of looking at the clips and looking at the tweets because they're so mischaracterized and they don't make any sense. Nene was very clear and she wasn't very messy about what she said. I just spoke a lot about that and I'm hoping that it made sense, and I have a lot to cover still, but I hope that made sense. And if I have to circle back in the next video, I definitely will, because I just think that it was a great point, and I think that is going to shed some light on a lot of stuff for us. She also spoke briefly about Cynthia. She obviously talked about her friendship with Cynthia, which I feel like we've talked about ad nauseum in the community. Like, we get it. And, she basically just talked about how there's a different Cynthia on camera than off camera. Fine. I think the most noted thing was Carlos asked, she basically had said, like, Cynthia wasn't really the personality, but Peter was. Like, when she met Peter, she was like, oh, Peter's got a lot going on. And she felt like the network was interested in Cynthia for her name, yes, but mostly because she had Peter, and that was going to bring drama. I just killed a bug. So, I think she's, in this instance, she's shedding light on the fact that, like, yeah, at this point now they're producing, right? Like, the show is just getting overproduced, and it's not the show that she's used to. And she even brought up, like, the trip where we got the iconic thing with Kenya. I'm going back to Kenya. But where Kenya got into that back and forth with Portia, and she started doing the twirl thing. And that's the same, at the same time where Portia said that there were 265 days in a year, right? And she said that's where she started to realize that things were shifting. She's like, okay, what is going on here? You know what I'm saying? So you really have to listen to what she's saying. And the fact that these women were being brought on strategically, it's always from a production standpoint, right? But it was being overproduced and it just felt kind of fabricated. So I think that she was giving us a lot of good information. She also talked about how she didn't necessarily feel like Phaedra should be on the show. She acknowledged, which we already know, if you watched back in the day, like she knew Phaedra back from Athens, Georgia. Like they had known each other back in high school, I believe it was. And, she said that she felt some type of way about Phaedra coming in onto the show. And I loved hearing that honesty. Like, I thought that was amazing. Even saying it right now, I'm like, wow, I really love that she was able to admit that, because that's a humble thing to be able to do. Like, I felt some type of way. Like, I know that girl from back in the day, and I felt some type of way that she was coming on the show. Carlos was even like, why? And she's just like, I just did. And that's a real thing. Like, she was talking about, like, this show is my baby, right? Like she shot the pilot, which we've never seen. She said, like, there was a pilot that involved her, Sheree, and Kim, and then some other ladies that were not Deshaun and Lisa. And then when they finally shot season 1, which we saw, it was with Deshaun and Lisa. So she said they basically shot season 1 twice, but we've only seen one version, right? So she feels like she's been there from the inception, and she watched this transition of where the show went, and now, it became this huge success off the backs of these women that weren't anybody before the show, right? And now there's people volleying to get on it, and production just kind of putting people on it just for like a wow factor, right? And not only that, now it's somebody that she actually knows. And I think there's also, she didn't say this, but I think there was also a hint of, she felt like maybe they're bringing this person on to combat me, because maybe she said this, she knew Phaedra, but maybe she wasn't friendly with Phaedra, so it felt like, okay, are they bringing her on because I'm guessing this, she didn't say this, but maybe she felt like they're bringing Phaedra on to combat her because they knew that they didn't have a favorable history, or maybe Phaedra gave them an inkling like, oh, I'll come on the show and beef with Nene, you know what I'm saying? So I think there may have been a piece of that in there as well, but she never said that. Kind of like the same thing if you watch Jersey, and you know how Teresa feels about Melissa coming on the show. She knew Melissa was coming on the show basically to beef with her. That's what her whole issue about it was. So I kind of got an inkling of that as well. Another noted thing I did want to talk about, she did mention her relationship with Yanni, and she was very honest about that as well. And she said, yes, she met and started dating him only a month after, Greg's passing, which was a lot of talk in the streets, and people were just like, oh my god, how do you grieve your husband? You started dating after that. And she was just like, that's kind of how I got through it, and we started as friends, and it really wasn't even that serious. She's like, it only got serious because people were seeing us out together, and it kind of made us be serious, which I think is real. Like, you're in the public eye, you're hanging out with somebody, and people are like, oh, they're together, oh, they're together. And it's like, well, we are hanging out, so, like, I don't know, maybe this is a thing. So y'all start kicking it a little bit more heavy. Like, I think that was real. Like, and I think that everything she was saying was authentic, and it didn't feel like fluff to me. And it made sense to me. And also, like, you could just use the general thing of, you can't tell people how to grieve. But I like that she gave that honest perspective. Like, that's a real thing. Like, yeah, y'all kind of pushed us to be kicking it heavier than we were. Like, it just kind of was what it was. And then she was even more honest to say, like, but they're not really kicking it right now, so it is what it is. So I did like hearing that as well. The interview kind of summed up with her talking about her relationship with Cynthia again, and Kenya more specifically, and just kind of saying, like, she felt like the ladies in general almost didn't give her, what was the word she used, because I don't want to mischaracterize anything. In essence, she was saying they didn't really give her the respect that she felt like she was owed, which kind of lends itself to this entitlement thing. But I'm going to explain why I think there's a difference for Nene. Because she didn't go into detail with it, and I wish that she had, and I wish that Carlos would have asked her. But she basically kept saying, I don't feel like they gave me the respect that I was owed. And she's like, because at one point I was the only OG there. And so maybe she did give enough context. Basically what she was saying was, it felt like season after season, ladies were coming on, and it lends itself to the Phaedra thing I was just saying. Ladies were coming on, it was always an attack against Nene. It always felt like somebody was against Nene. So she just felt like it was a pile up, and she just felt like that wasn't fair. So that is her issue with the ladies. And, even with her having a genuine relationship with Cynthia, she feels like, the ladies got into Cynthia's ear and were, kind of like giving, well, you're Nene's lapdog and like you don't have a voice or whatever. So that kind of changed her dynamic with Cynthia. And then she also feels like her issue with Kenya was kind of like this battle for like who's the star of Atlanta almost. She didn't necessarily say that, but that's in essence what she was saying. And Carlos asked her like, were you threatened by Kenya being on the show, her potentially being the star of the show? And she said, I don't feel like anybody was ever the star of the show but me, really. Like, she's like, I don't ever feel like Kenya was the star of the show, and I was never threatened by any of those other ladies. And I would have to agree that Kenya isn't the star of Atlanta, but I also don't think that that's an argument because I don't think that Kenya has ever said that or volleyed for that position. So I don't think that that's ever an argument. I think it was a good question from Carlos because it did come off as, especially in the Pillow Talk episode, it did come off as Nene was a little bit threatened by Kenya, and she sometimes felt like Kenya was coming for that top spot. She may not have really recognized it in that time, but it felt like a little bit of like her volleying for the recognition that she wasn't getting. Like, all these things tie together for me. And that's why I'm saying I feel like Nene is lacking some type of self-awareness. I don't think it's on purpose, but I think she needs to combine these things and realize that I think she was battling some insecurities on that show. And she had a certain level of entitledness, is that the word? Like, she just felt entitled to, like, she wanted some type of respect for those ladies, rightfully so. Like, she was the OG, but at the same time, Carlos is telling her like, well, I didn't see it like that. Like, those ladies really did look up to you, and they really were, following your lead. And she's like, well, I didn't feel like that. I feel like they were piling on me. But she also said I can be completely wrong, right? And I wish that's why I'm just saying, I wish that she had somebody to give her the perspective to be like, look, what you wanted is not wrong, right? Like, you wanted a certain type of level of acknowledgement from these ladies. And I think that they were giving you what they could, granted the situation, right? Like, Nene didn't really have a great relationship with these ladies. And I think that Nene's perspective is that it's coming from the ladies and maybe even production. I think she feels like she was being piled up on and they weren't supporting her. That's the word that she used. They didn't support her, not respect. They weren't supporting her and they weren't, putting her in the role of the OG. Whereas I think that they were, but they just weren't doing it the way that she wanted, right? And so she wasn't receiving it. And when she wasn't receiving it, I think Nene was somebody to be a little bit cold and kind of lash out, and her ego would take over, and she would be a little bit kind of like nasty about it almost. And so that turned the ladies off. I think that's always been her issue with Candy. Like, I just don't feel like I think Candy always respected Nene. And, always felt like Nene was Nene. I think even to this day she does. But Nene had her ego just caused her to have some type of attitude. And Candy wasn't the type to bow down to that. And I think it got to a place where none of those ladies would. Like, at that point, you have to imagine who was there, right? We've got Candy. She's not going to bow down to Nene. We've got Kenya. She's not going to bow down to Nene. Her and Cynthia ended up being at odds. Phaedra, they were always at odds. You know what I'm saying? So at this point, you don't have any ladies on the show that feel like they need to bow down to Nene. Yeah, we're going to respect you, but we're not respecting you in the way that you feel like respect is. I think Nene has a different understanding of what respect is, a different expectation of what respect should be. And she's not wrong for that. That's just her. I don't think it's a malicious thing behind it, but that's why I'm saying I think that she lacks the self-awareness and also some accountability because, again, she feels like it was always the ladies against her, but I think she's missing the part where she played a role in it, and that part is her ego. So I hope that all of those things connect. I thought it was a great interview so far, and I'm excited about part two. I think part two is going to be more so about the lawsuit, but I'm hoping, like I said, it feels like Carlos had a certain opinion, she had a certain opinion, and they were volleying those back and forth, and they were expressing that they had differing opinions. But I think that the way that Carlos does interviews is, because I've seen him do it with other housewives, he doesn't necessarily impose his opinion or even say it. He'll speak on it a little bit, but he's more so just going to let them get theirs out. Whereas I wish sometimes that he would say, well, consider this point. You know what I'm saying? And I think he was getting there. Because, like I said, Nene would say something. He's like, "Well, I didn't see it that way." Specifically where she was like, "I feel like the girls didn't like support me." He's like, "Well, I didn't see it that way." So he was getting there, but I wish that he would have been able to be like, "Look, they respected you and supported you more than you think that they did, and I think that your ego got a little bit in the way." Respectfully, sis. Like, I feel like that's all Nene needs to hear, and I think that she's in a space where she could receive that. And I think that she will be able to sit back and consider it. She doesn't necessarily have to agree, but I think it would be something beautiful for her to consider. And I think it would take her so incredibly far. So I thought it was a great interview. And I really love everything she had to say about the dynamic of the show and about the ladies. I would say my only issue with Nene in general, like I said, is sometimes she can come off bitter. And there was a tiny pinch, like, ooh, this much of a pinch in there with this interview itself, just when they talked about the viewers. Like, she was talking about the viewers back when she was on the show versus now. She made a little joke. And I want her to stick with the recipe of, she didn't say this, but it always feels like it's a shot to the ladies as opposed to the production. And I would love it more if she would just keep it to a production and network thing, because I just wouldn't I wouldn't blame the ladies for coming in and doing their job. We understand that there's a messed up formula for Atlanta now, but she makes this argument a lot in the interview where she says, I always just really wanted the ladies to come in and make money. That's what she's saying. Like, I wanted us to work together. I understand we have to work together to make money. That's where I am. So I wish that she still shared that opinion. I understand she's not on the show anymore, and the way that she exited was not positive. So I can understand her not supporting the show and supporting the ladies anymore. But and she has no obligation to. But I just wish that she kept that energy of, whatever, let them be well, let them make money. The issue is with production and with, the network. There is an argument to be made that the ladies aren't necessarily showing up for work and they're not really doing what they need to do to make the show work. There's definitely that argument there. We've all made that argument. I've made that argument. But she's also said that she doesn't watch the show. So I feel like if you don't watch the show, I wouldn't necessarily make negative comments about the ladies. If I have an issue with the network and I have an issue with production, which she has said that she has, then I'm going to blame them for how the show is going. We already know if the ladies aren't showing up for work, then yes, they're to blame. But I just don't feel like the shots need to be at the ladies, especially if she feels like and I'm not saying that she does, but if she still feels like she wants the ladies to come together and make money, or she feels like she said she feels like the show is her baby, if you want the show to be successful, or if you have any hopes of ever coming back on the show and working with these ladies, right? Because you can tell it hurt her feelings back in the day when she was out. You have to look between these arguments and these beef. It was clear that it hurt her feelings that she had to be like, these ladies are not my friends. They're my coworkers. You can tell that hurt her feelings, and she was just acting out. So if that's something that hurts you and you want to get past it, which I deep down believe is something that Nene would love, I just want her to take the shots and the bitterness away from the ladies and keep it at the system. And I think that she's coming around to that, and I think it was clear in the way that she was speaking in the interview that she understands what the issue is. But I'm just hoping. And again, she never said it was a shot to the ladies. It just comes off that way when she talks about the viewers and how the show is going down the hill. It comes off that way. That's all I'm saying. So I just, that's what I would hope. But I'm excited to see part 2. I know that was super long, but it was a really good interview. You guys should go watch it. And please don't just look at the clips on the internet and what people are saying and tweeting, because it's very mischaracterized and very just all over the place. Go listen to what the lady said, because she said some really good stuff. So kudos to Nene and Carlos, and I'm excited to see part 2. And we'll be back.